Welcome back to Sports Class with Dr. K. It's January and that can mean only one thing. Happy New Year! Thanks to all of you who watched in 2019, and we're looking forward to even better things in 2020. So subscribe to the channel for more updates and future videos. Before we move on to new things in 2020, we're going to look back one last time to 2019 and the decade just passed, the 2010s. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at the first 5 years of that decade, 2010 to 2014. It's time for a quick costume change. We're going to focus on the biggest stories in each year and look at a few other highlights along the way. So let's start with 2010. The Super Bowl winner that year was the New Orleans Saints, which was a huge deal for them, their first Super Bowl win, knocking off the Colts. The NCAA hoops champ was Duke, which isn't that unusual, but remember, that was the year Butler almost pulled off a miracle half-court shot to knock them off in the title game. And the World Series was won by the San Francisco Giants. Again, not that unusual, but this was the first of their 3 wins in the decade, every even year over a stretch of 5 years. This was also an Olympic year, the Winter Olympics in Vancouver. Remember, the star of those Olympics was Apollo Ono and Bodie Miller on the downhill. And it was a World Cup year, and we all remember the annoying vuvuzelas that plagued us in the South African World Cup. But the biggest story of the year, without question, 2010, was the collapse of Tiger Woods. He was on top of the sports world as the year began, but by the end of that year, his life away from the course and on the course was crumbling. Remember, it began Thanksgiving in 2009 when he inexplicably crashed his car in his driveway. That led to a series of revelations about affairs. His marriage began to crumble, and by the next year, April 2010, his career on the course was starting to crumble with a series of injuries. It was going to be another decade before he won another major, the Masters in 2019, which we'll get to by the end of our recap of the decade in sports. On to 2011. Some of the surprising champions of that year were the Super Bowl champs Green Bay Packers and the NBA champion Dallas Mavericks, who both pulled off upsets as major underdogs. You might remember Dirk Nowitzki of the Dallas Mavericks leading a big upset of the Lakers. Some of the other stories of that year were the NBA lockout, conference realignment in NCAA football, and those underdog wins. But the biggest story of the year, without question, this is an easy one because it may be the biggest story of the entire decade. The Penn State scandal of Jerry Sandusky and sexual abuse. Jerry Sandusky, the longtime defensive coordinator at Penn State, was accused of a series of sexual abuses of young boys on the Penn State campus. As the scandal unfolded and Penn State tried to finish out its football season, ultimately the president of the campus resigned and Joe Paterno, the famous head coach, was forced to resign. Joe Paterno died not long after that, and some claimed that that scandal killed him. What else happened in 2011, you wonder? That was the year that IBM's computer Watson defeated 2 of Jeopardy's biggest champions. 2012. Among the noteworthy champions that year were Alabama in NCAA football, the 6th straight SEC school to win the title. And the San Francisco Giants won the World Series. This was their second in 3 years. The Miami Heat, LeBron James and his super team won their first title in 2012. This was also an Olympic year. You guys remember the 2012 London Olympics. The star, of course, was Michael Phelps, who won his 19th medal ever to become the winningest Olympian of all time. And also Usain Bolt, the great Jamaican sprinter who starred in those Olympics. There were lots of noteworthy events that year in sport, so honorable mention goes to things like Linsanity, the meteoric rise of New York Knicks point guard Jeremy Lin. Bountygate in New Orleans, the New Orleans Saints accused of targeting players on their defense. Miguel Cabrera's Triple Crown in baseball. All of these were big stories, but the number one story of that year, without question, was the fall of Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong, considered one of America's great sports heroes for many years, and his exploits in the Tour de France went down as some of the great athletic accomplishments ever. For years, Armstrong defended himself against accusations that he had been doping, and it seemed he was the one clean champion in that sport. But finally, in 2012, it all came crumbling down, and Lance admitted that he had been doping all along, and in fact was at the center of an elaborate cheating ring. The collapse and fall of Lance Armstrong is one of the worst in sports history. 2013. The Super Bowl winner was the Baltimore Ravens. Not all that remarkable, except they seemed to be aided by a 30-minute power outage at halftime of the game that threw off the San Francisco 49ers. The NCAA football champ was Alabama again. The NHL champ was the Chicago Blackhawks, after a 2-month lockout delayed the season. And the winner of the World Series was the Boston Red Sox. I'll get more on that in just a minute. Again in 2013, there were many stories that rank as honorable mention here. The Jonathan Martin bullying scandal in Miami, A-Rod and biogenesis. But the biggest story of that year was the Boston Marathon bombing. On April 15th, as many runners neared the finish line, 2 pressure cooker bombs exploded. The manhunt that followed was almost as dramatic as the bombing itself, as a couple of days later, the 2 suspects engaged in a shootout with police, one of them being killed and one captured. The rest of that year, Boston engaged in an emotional sporting revival, capped by the Boston Red Sox winning the World Series. And the last year we're going to review in this episode, 2014. Some of the remarkable champions included the NCAA football champions, Florida State. But you might remember the Auburn Tigers had a number of remarkable last-second finishes that season, which I have discussed in a previous video, so check out that video for more information on those remarkable finishes. The NCAA hoops champ was Connecticut, and the women's Connecticut Huskies went 40-0 and also won the championship that year, a remarkable double feat for the Connecticut Huskies. The World Series champs, you guessed it, the San Francisco Giants for the 3rd time in 5 years. But the biggest story of that year was the introduction of the NCAA football playoff. Now, the first round of the playoffs wasn't played in 2014, but by the end of that 2014 season, the first playoff teams had been identified and included Florida State again and Ohio State that went on to win the championship the next year. To hear more about that, watch the next episode in our recap of the decade of the 2010s. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.